kind of key questions I always kind of come up with, what people tend to ask me is, how much should I eat? What should I eat? How often should I eat in ultras? So it's a pretty tricky question because everyone's different. And a lot of this is going to depend on the duration of the event, the intensity in terms of what your pace is, what the weather's like, if it's hot, if it's cold, if there's a lot of climbing on there, your own, personal carb oxidation or fat oxidation. And then also things like what you're actually eating on the course, what have you ate around that, what your regular diet is. These are all good things which are going to make a difference in terms of how many carbs you're going to burn within that race. So I'll try and cover it as much as possible and give you a bit of an outlier in terms of what you should be looking at in terms of various paces and your own weight and intensity and kind of things like that. So what I'm going to do today is sort of break it down. If we think about this overall, we're thinking about, first up, nutrition for training adaptation. So your everyday nutrition, keeping you healthy, supporting your immune system, also making sure you're getting fueled properly day to day and making sure that you're getting the right nutrition to support and maintain those training adaptations and get quality training. There's pre-race nutrition as well. So I've put on there 3 days, but this could really be a week out. So this is altering your nutrition a little bit, a few days out, which could be increasing a bit more fat to increase fat burning. Obviously, carb loading in those days. And then in the 2 days prior to your race, going on a low residue diet. So cutting out a lot of fiber, cutting out a lot of protein, cutting out a lot of fat. So you've not got the same amount of bulk in your system. And also, to reduce the chance of getting GI distress. Again, I'm not going to talk about that now. I'm going to talk about it more in a different session when I'll start to talk about, gastrointestinal problems and sorting out your gut and things like that. And then what I'm going to talk about today is race and competition nutrition. So basically what you are eating on the race or competition or FKT or whatever it is you're doing. And then the sort of final piece of the puzzle then is recovery nutrition. So thinking about, replenishing your glycogen levels as well through eating carbohydrates, protein for muscle repair, adequate fluid as well. And then this cycle basically starts all over again. So to move on a little bit, in terms of race nutrition then, so we think what could go wrong. So for you guys, you had any major issues in the past with your race nutrition?
Yeah, I mean, I've had shocking issues with mine, mostly on sort of my Bob Graham rounds. I think it's largely been due to just not knowing what to eat, probably shoveling too much of the wrong stuff down me, too many gels, etc. And then I don't know, it's hard to know the explanation for it afterwards, but probably if you don't have a proper plan apart from to shovel carbs down you, it's not necessarily going to go to plan.
Yeah, and with nutrition, particularly on the Bob Graham round, I almost feel it needs to be structured like you would structure training. Again, from my own experiences of this, people kind of go out there and they say, oh, it's that, I forget who made it, that famous quote where they say, oh, you have to eat for an ultra, it's an eating competition. But actually, what you'll realize is you've got a crew who are trying to put food down your neck all the time. And when it's just not regulated, you could be taking on a lot of fat, a lot of fiber, too many carbs, which are just it's either going to slow your gut down and create issues, or just going to make you throw it all up or feel nauseous. Whatever the impact, it's going to be detrimental to your performance, and well may scupper your chances of completing that challenge. So going into the Bob Graham in particular, pretty important to have a really kind of structured plan. Howard, anything for you?
Quite a few of them things there on the bullet points. I have started getting hyperglycemia a couple of times recently.
Right.
But that's mainly before I do the shorter sessions. Just my normal day-to-day stuff.
Yeah.
I don't normally get it on the longer run, so I've had hyperglycemia. I think the main one for me has just been underfueling and getting to the end of a race and feeling like proper, like I've hit the wall, under fueling.
Yeah. So again, with all these things, in terms of what could go wrong, then obviously, the first thing's going to be depletion of glycogen stores in your muscle and your liver, to that fact. But with ultras, if we're talking about a marathon now, this would be a major issue. With ultras, not quite the same, pure because A, we're reducing our pace, but B, there's no way of getting around it in an ultra. Maybe in a short ultra of 32 miles or something, where you could maybe do it in under 5 hours, let's say, there's a chance that you might not deplete all your glycogen stores. But for everyone else, one of the biggest issues within ultras is the fact that your endogenous fuel sources in terms of carbs are going to go within the sort of first 3 to 5 hours. So it means carbs are really, really important to put in to keep muscles contracting as they should do. Obviously, part of that's about underfueling, not eating enough, and getting fatigued early. Hypoglycemia is an issue as well, and the fact that you can get hypoglycemic basically when both your muscles and your liver glycogen's depleted and your blood glucose goes down. So you'll get feelings of weakness, you'll get really hungry, you'll get dizzy. I've got hypoglycemia in the past and passed out. I'd say in an ultra, it's quite difficult to get hypoglycemia unless you're running at a really intense pace, just because your liver will start to break down other bits, within your metabolism to produce carbohydrates to keep feeding itself, and the rate at which you're running will hopefully kind of it'll balance itself out. But what I would say is, if you're up in the pace or you're training hard, or again with many ultras, you're on trails and you're running up hills or mountains, then actually you can deplete glycogen pretty quick and burn it down and really kind of get hypoglycemic. So again, it's slightly rarer, but it is a threat. Dehydration as well in ultras, and loss of a performance through that, purely because the race I was doing at the weekend, between checkpoints was 40 miles, and between those checkpoints was the middle of the night. There's nothing else. There's nothing to drink. So again, dehydration can create GI issues. More than 2% body weight loss can create losses in performance as well. Aspects of hyponatremia as well, basically taking on too much fluid, which is really rare. People talk about it a lot, but it's really rare. And I'd say in a lot of ultras, it's difficult to become hyponatremic purely because there's not much water on the course. However, there are times when people will get hyponatremia, but it might be for a small amount of time, and it might start to make you feel ill. But basically, if you stop drinking for a little bit, it'll pass. What I've seen in terms of ultra runners who get hyponatremia, more often than not, it's people who've got a crew who can drink fairly regular, or it's people doing 24-hour track competitions where every 400 meters you've got access to food and water. So people occasionally overhydrate on these. But again, I'd say we hear a lot about hyponatremia, but it's still really, really rare. But obviously, the symptoms of it can be really severe. GI distress is going to be the biggest issue. And again, most of the time, this is going to be dialed into your nutrition, either the nutrition you're taking in competition or actually your day-to-day nutrition, or the nutrition you're taking on leading up to that. And then fine, just choosing the wrong foods to eat, which are going to cause issues, which again, I'll talk a little bit about more on this. But first thing I want to talk about really is, where it all starts, which is carbohydrate metabolism. So things have kind of changed a little bit recently in terms of how we understand this, but from sort of the late 90s, early 2000s, everyone was taking on 60 grams of glucose an hour. So Tour de France, big races, the max they would be doing is kind of 60 grams an hour, and that's because people thought that you could only absorb 1 gram of carbs per minute through glucose, which comes through. This is a little diagram of your gut. So on the left, that's the inside of your gut. This SGLT1 GLUT5 are basically the lining of your gut wall, and then that's the internal lumen, and then that's your blood. So basically, glucose gets taken through this wall into that space and then out into your blood. So it gets transported through this SGLT1 and GLUT5. So 60 grams per hour of glucose can go through SGLT1. And then early 2000s, they discovered you could actually get, so it gets saturated at 60 grams, but fructose you could get through at 30 grams an hour through GLUT5. So this is where they kind of bumped it up to 90 grams of carbs an hour. So again, glucose and fructose, obviously both carbs, with that kind of mix, it meant people could take on a lot more. So this is where you'll see in a lot of gel packets, like it'll say dual carb source, which is basically just glucose and fructose, and it'll say 2-to-1 ratio. So it's 2-to-1 glucose to fructose. So 60 grams of glucose, 30 grams of fructose. Until recently, though, this was kind of a norm. But over the last couple of years, what people have realized is that you can actually take on a lot more fructose than people are saying. So people have, like Morton, SIS, Be It Fuel, have changed that ratio now. So it's 1 to 0.8, which means you can take up to about 120, 125 grams an hour, essentially, of carbohydrates. And this ratio is much better tolerated, people are starting to find. So it's kind of changed things quite a lot. Again, they're the only kind of people who are doing it, Morton and SIS. But it's sort of catching on. All the cool kids seem to be going, 120 grams an hour now, when actually not so long ago, no one wanted to eat carbs at all because they thought they were detrimental to performance. What I'd say about 120 grams an hour is, people talk about it a lot. People are putting on their Instagram going, yeah, I'm smashing all these carbs in. But there's not really any science to support it yet. The science that's come out around this is, again, there's only a handful of papers on this, but they've said that we've not really found a performance benefit yet. Still some trials need to be done on actual performance, but a lot of the science basically says that at the upper end, you simply just end up burning more carbs. And this is the thing, the more carbs you take on, the more carbs you'll burn. It's the same with fat. The more fat you take on, the more fat you burn. So at that upper end of 120 grams, you're just utilizing a lot more carbs and utilizing less fat, basically. There is a little bit of research that says up at that top end, you might actually burn through your glycogen a little bit quicker as well. So actually, you've got to structure your training pretty well in your competition. So if you decide to take on 120 grams an hour, I would say do it a little bit later on and build up to it, maybe at the 4-hour mark, rather than just kind of going straight off the bat. Again, it depends on your race, your intensity, and what you're doing. If it's a super fast race, which is relatively short, and you're going to get through a lot of energy, then yeah, you could kind of go out straight away with 120 grams. But again, I'd probably back off a little bit. Some of the top Tour de France teams last year, like Jumbo Visma, they were still taking 90 grams an hour, and they absolutely dominated it. So again, people are talking about it, I wouldn't actually say jump up to that level yet, just because there's not enough to support it, and it just means you're spending a lot more money on gels, and you've got to carry a lot more as well, when you might be over-egging it a little bit in terms of what your race is doing, what your intensity is, the duration of that as well. So as I say, what will make a difference to what you're taking on is going to be pace, intensity, and glycogen depletion. So, if you run at 60% VO2 max, there's going to be major depletion in muscle glycogen. So that'll last you about 3 hours or so. At slower rates, glycogen will be depleted by about 5 hours. So again, in some of the press and things, it talks about taking on carbohydrates to spare glycogen. But again, recent research says it's not possible. you can't spare muscle glycogen at all. You can spare liver glycogen, but whatever happens, doesn't matter how much you take on, your muscle glycogen will still get used. So again, by the time you get through to about 5 hours, your glycogen is going to be depleted. Once glycogen becomes depleted, then actually your fat oxidation will go up. So you'll start to burn more fat as a fuel. However, the higher the intensity, the more reliant on carbs you are for energy. So again, fat is obviously a great fuel source, but it can't produce energy at the same rate as carbohydrates. So your pace is going to be limited by how much you can produce energy. So again, if you want a high intensity race and you're a larger athlete who needs more energy as well, it's longer and you're going to deplete those energy stores more, then actually you probably want more carbs. And again, this is going to support you later on. And, hopefully you'll have less fatigue. Lots of studies have showed that by taking carbs, you're able to increase time to exhaustion, which is exactly what you want in ultra. So moving on a little bit. So what should we eat? So again, this comes up quite a lot, and I put an Instagram post about this up the other day. So again, I heard people talk a lot about how much calories we should have an hour. And actually, I wouldn't really worry about that, calories or carbs. If you're doing something that's not a multi-day event, then focus on carbs. If it's a multi-day event like Cape Wrath or Dragon's Back, where you've got a camp at night, and you can restock and replenish, then actually, focus on calories. There was this case study from I think this was 2018 or 2019, which looked at did a laboratory test with someone who's doing Marathon des Sables, and what they did with this athlete is they gave them their full nutrient allowance. So it basically almost met them for calorie to calorie, and then they did that on half rations as well. So they looked at, is it better to go out and do Marathon des Sables with half rations, so you're carrying less in your pack, or actually carry more and have full rations? What they found is, and what this athlete reported was, over the days, each day they felt less fatigued when they took in full calories, and then later in the week, by sort of day 3 to 4, they were walking a lot less, so they were running a little bit more. What I would say about this, and again, in the ultra space, there's not much research on this, so we're kind of picking out things where we can. But you've got to remember, this is a case study built on one athlete. And when I dipped into it, what I noticed is when they were on full rations, actually what doubled was the amount of carbs they were taking on. So, is this a case of they were better and performed better in the week and were less fatigued because we took on full calories, or is it just because we took on a lot more carbs? So again, it's always difficult to tell. So as I say, within a race, within a competition, I would prioritize carbohydrates. The whole idea of calories probably comes around because, for most ultras, a lot of research has shown that people run them at around 45 to 60% VO2 max, which is your kind of, top of zone 1 pace, let's say. So that really kind of easy, chilled ultra pace where you can chat away. Your breathing isn't labored, your heart rate isn't very high. And again, at this rate, you're burning about 50-50 carbohydrate and fat, or even a little bit more, which is more sort of 60% fat and 40% carbohydrates. So again, if we start to think about that as calories, then all we need to do is think, oh, well, half those calories are our carbs. So if we're burning 600 calories an hour at that rate, then 300 calories of that are carbohydrates. And then there's 4 calories in every gram of carbohydrates. So we can start to work back from there and think, as a bit of a ballpark figure, how many carbs that we actually want from that point. So again, we always want to sort of reach the highest point, the highest level. So we don't want to underfuel. We want to take on the maximum we can, to meet those energy needs and those energy demands. again, so we're not dropping the pace, so we don't feel quite as fatigued. So this paper, it's from 1989. This is quite interesting. It details the nutrition of Yanis Kouros, who's probably the greatest ultra runner in the world ever. And this was the 1985 Sydney to Melbourne race, which was 980 kilometers, and he completed in 5 days and 5 hours. So on that race, he ate every 15 minutes. And this was mostly carbs. In fact, it was 95.6% of his whole maximum energy intake. So this was sweets, sugar, things like that. Basically everything he could. A lot of kind of Greek sweets and things like that. Through all these sweets, he managed to meet his calorie expenditure. And on this, again, I put some little equations together I took from there. So his average VO2 max in the first day was 57%, and then that dropped to 44% by day 5 when he won it. His weight change across that race was only half a kilo, so it was pretty weight stable. So it shows that he was meeting calorie for calorie. But when you kind of look at it per minute, on average, he was burning about 4.8 calories per minute. So this was 288 calories per hour. And his RER on that was 85. So this is respiratory exchange ratio, which basically is kind of gas exchange. If you were doing a decent VO2 max test, it'd give you this range. But at 0.85, that means he's burning 50-50 fat to carbs. So you can work out exactly what his carbohydrate needs for that. But he was meeting those needs and more, which is quite interesting. And again, this is him. But what they're saying in that paper is his ability to maintain a higher average speed as compared with other athletes is perhaps a result of his continuous supply of nutrients during the race, as evidenced by the data collected. So again, what they're putting this down to, the fact that he was able to maintain that pace throughout. And I think the person who came in second was 24 hours later. They put it down to the fact that he was taking on all this energy and taking all these carbs. And they produced a little table of his whole week there. So it's well worth dipping in and having a look at that. It's really interesting. So thinking about, the right foods, and again, thinking about macronutrients, I've talked about carbs, but protein comes into that as well. And again, I'm putting this in because I hear loads of people say, oh, well, I need a protein shake on my race or this and that. In terms of running, protein's only used as there's only a small amount of protein used as an energy substrate. So this can be anywhere between sort of 5 and 15%. For elite athletes or really well-trained athletes, it's actually a lot lower than that. Less trained athletes will burn more protein, oxidize more protein during training and competition than well-trained athletes. The thing with this is, it relates not to protein as such, but carbohydrates. So if you're not meeting your carbohydrate demands on a race, then actually your body's looking around to think, okay, what else can I use as a fuel source? So it'll start to break amino acids down from your muscle. It'll take these to your liver, and through gluconeogenesis, it'll turn these into glucose. It's basically breaking those amino acids down to turn them into more carbs. So if you take on more carbohydrates, actually, you're going to stop using quite as much protein as a fuel source. And again, so you're supporting lean tissue and lean muscle, because the last thing you want to be doing is oxidizing more muscle. So exercise causes a rise in stress hormone cortisol. So cortisol is catabolic in the fact that it uses muscle as a substrate for energy production. But taking on carbohydrates, they actually dampen that stress response. So they dampen the cortisol response. So again, you're able to lower the rate of protein use. So when you hear people going, oh, I'm going to take protein on or things like that, wouldn't really do it unless you've got a race longer than, say, over 20 hours. And again, that's just the figure I'm kind of plucking out when I'm thinking about almost a full day and what might happen to your body and the changes over that time. So if you take on a lot of protein, it might lead to slower gastric emptying, which again can create issues such as GI issues, things like that. The study that I've put on there found that during exercise in the heat, both protein and carbohydrates increase blood flow to the gut and could potentially reduce GI issues. But in the group which took on the protein, they had a higher incidence of reporting GI issues than the carbohydrate group. So again, it shows you how important they are. But protein has been associated with more gut distress than carbohydrates. And then with this, you think, well, should I just avoid protein completely? Again, I'd factor it into your race, but again, it depends on what your race is and what the context and the situation is. So there's been quite a bit of debate around this, and I put a couple of papers there. So during longer races where calories and carbohydrate intake might be lower, some studies have showed that in cyclists, time to exhaustion is increased when they take on protein. And the criticism around this is the fact that in these studies, carbohydrate intake was lower than the guidelines recommend. And actually, when people took on protein, it increased the amount of calories above the control group. But actually, if you think about an ultra, that might be a bit of a bonus because you're probably not always going to meet your carbohydrate needs. Again, you might get gut issues at some point. You might not be able to carry all your nutrition. You might get chatting or just forget, or the weather's terrible and you can't get it, or you've got a bit of taste fatigue. So actually, if somewhere else you can get in a little bit more energy, then so be it. And again, protein will mix it up a little bit and add a few new flavors into what you're doing. So it could be a way that you can beat taste fatigue as well. So again, some of these criticisms actually could be a bonus within ultras. I'd say for longer ultras, so Dragon's Back and the Spine, Cape Wrath, things like that. So really, really long single stage races or multi-stage races. We can use some of this data to provide some positive benefits, to take protein during the race. And again, over length of time, we still want to meet our protein needs because we still need to support muscle, repair damaged tissue, not go into a large deficit. So yeah, so we want to take protein on for that, but we just don't need to overdo it. I'd say for anything under 20 hours, don't even worry about protein at all. Just make sure after your race, you take on, a large amount of protein, so 0.49 grams per kilogram of body weight, or roughly sort of 30 to 35 grams, and then just kind of factor it into your diet as you would normally, and this will help you to repair and recover. Again, kind of dipped into it a bit more. So a 2017 position stand on protein suggests for endurance athletes that added protein does not appear to improve endurance performance. But however, adding protein suppresses markers of muscle damage 12 to 24 hours post-exercise and decreases the endurance athlete's feelings of muscle soreness. For these reasons include 0.25 grams per hour in addition to carbohydrates. Again, that's what this paper, and this is kind of a meta study of lots of different papers. Not every paper agrees with that, but it's well worth putting some protein in on, as I say, on particular multi-stage race, because in a couple of days' time, it's probably going to help you bounce back a little bit. You might get a little bit less muscle soreness, but certainly you're not going to go into a deficit, which is good. Above this, though, what I'd say is adequate carbohydrate intake should be the priority. So again, if this wasn't a multi-stage race, a tactic could well be every couple of hours, take something with 5 grams of protein in. So you might put a few energy bars in there. So the Velo Forte bars, for instance. I'm not sponsored by Velo Forte, but it should sponsor me because I pitch them quite often. They're 40 grams of carbs in each bar. And actually, most bars have got about 5 grams of protein. So put a few of those in your bag. And actually, what you realize is you can get a pretty big hit of carbs on with them, and you can take on a bit of protein and beat taste fatigue a little bit with something that is approaching kind of real food and a quite nice taste as well. Checkpoints and things like that. If you take on sandwiches, anything like that, you will be taking on aspects of protein. If you go out and take corn snacks, which I'll talk about in a bit, or mini pretzels, they've got protein in as well. So again, a lot of protein. I probably wouldn't worry about it too much, because if you're taking on various checkpoint foods or savory foods, as I say, you're going to take protein in through the back door anyway. Killian, last year when he set the UTMB record, I chatted to him about this, and he took on 5 grams of protein every 2 hours. And I asked him why, what are the performance benefits of that? And he said there wasn't any. It just helped him recover faster. It experimented with it, and he felt better after the race, which is quite interesting. So as I say, longer than 20 hours, aim for 5 grams of protein per hour. Every 2 hours or so. But test it, because it might slow your GI system down, create gut distress. Again, at the paces you'd be running a longer race on, particularly if you're out there for over 20 hours, probably going to be minimal. For most athletes that I see, protein never seems to be a problem at all. Lots of other foods are a problem, but protein never seems to be the thing that kind of creates the issues. So again, I probably wouldn't fear protein too much, but probably wouldn't go drinking protein shakes all the time or anything like that. You don't quite need to get that amount.